I thank the honourable member for Moreton. The question now is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the honourable member for Griffith.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, this of course is a bill that relates to producer interests, the interests of the creative industries that create content like music or video or software. And of course it's important for our nation to provide appropriate support for producers, because without them obviously there's no content. But as much as it's appropriate to consider producer interests, as representatives we should also consider consumer interests. We should concern ourselves with dealing with those consumer interests when it comes to content that's available to people here in Australia. It's fair to say, Deputy Speaker, that Australian consumers of digital products want fair and timely access to content. It's been described as being more of an issue about service than about price. In other words, if consumers had more more convenient access and more timely access to digital content, then the fact that they would also have to pay for it in a lawful way would not dissuade them, is the view, in respect of using that more lawful or that lawful way of obtaining content. And so, Deputy Speaker, that's not just my view. There was a concern that was it's been around for some time in relation to how people can get access to digital content in this country in a fair and timely way. And last year, Essential Media Communications, the research firm, undertook research that indicated that 79% of Australians are concerned about being charged significantly more than their US counterparts for digital products. 58% were concerned that movies and TV shows were available for legal download in other countries but not in Australia. And Deputy Speaker, unfortunately, the Abbott government, though moving on this producer interest bill, has done, in my view, regrettably little to deal with these legitimate community concerns about the detriments that consumers face in Australia compared with in other nations. And price discrimination in relation to digital content continues to affect Australian households. Deputy Speaker, a friend of mine, a very old friend of mine, by the name of Michelle Richards, recently wrote a paper on some of the motivations around piracy in Australia, and she, I think, quite neatly summarised these issues of consumer access to content, and so I'm going to quote her, which will come as a surprise to her. Unfortunately, I haven't had time to mention this to her, so I hope she doesn't mind. She said, "Within the Australian television media landscape, a unique industrial, institutional and legislative framework shapes consumers' viewing habits. Australia's commercial media ownership is one of the highest concentrations in the world, and our isolated geographic location as an English-speaking country amongst Asian markets has meant that English and American media companies and local distributors were free to designate price according to demand without competition." Deputy Speaker, she said, "This became commonly known under the term the Australia tax, a term that is commonly used," I'm now interposing my comments, to describe the level of price discrimination that we have here in Australia. She went on to say, Deputy Speaker, there have been recent demands on the ACCC to look into the unfair pricing practices of streamers who charge up to 376% more for digital content when compared to overseas markets. And Deputy Speaker, this issue of competition, of course, is changing here in Australia. We are seeing the introduction of services like Stan, like Presto, and similar services from the pay TV providers. But we're still in a situation where there is an issue for Australian consumers in relation to access to content, digital content such as movies, televisions, music, software, etc. So, Deputy Speaker, it's fair to say that people, when they're looking at this bill, are concerned about what this bill and what this government is doing to address those consumer-side concerns, not just producer-side concerns. Deputy Speaker, those are legitimate questions to be asked of this government, which is not to say that we shouldn't be looking at legislative and regulatory mechanisms to combat piracy. Of course we should, and on our side of the House we agree that action is needed to reduce current levels of online piracy in Australia. We understand the need to make sure that creative industries can remain in a situation where they have viable business models, and of course if your content, if you're not recovering the full extent of the revenue that you ought to recover in respect of the content that you develop, that is obviously of great concern to the businesses concerned. And we are talking about an important and vibrant creative industry sector in Australia, which is something that people on both sides of this House and both sides of this Parliament have worked for many years to promote. And Deputy Speaker, I'm informed that our nation continues to have a high level of piracy by international standards, and of course that necessarily leads to economic damage and also necessarily leads to adverse impacts for Australian jobs in content production and creation here in Australia. And so accordingly we continue to say that more should be done for consumers and for looking at the pricing issues in respect of content. We are prepared to support this bill, which we believe to be a modest and common sense measure, which is intended to disrupt foreign websites operating as havens for piracy and to discourage copyright infringement by Australian consumers. It is true that some websites seem to be set up for the direct purpose and egregious purpose of taking away intellectual property, of breaching copyright and of harming producer interests. And so this bill, being directed at foreign websites whose primary purpose is to infringe copyright or facilitate the infringement of copyright, is an important yet balanced bill when it comes to trying to disrupt some of the piracy that occurs in Australia at the moment. I'm sure that other speakers in this debate have spoken about the number of times, for example, that Game of Thrones was downloaded on the 4th season premiere. Sort of nearly 200,000 separate downloads in Australia. The companies do try to fast track broadcasts of the television shows that drive demand. They do try to innovate in that regard. But the fact is, we do continue to have a piracy issue, which is which appears to be really a product of those issues that I've mentioned, but also I think something that's grown up over a long period of time. Is not really, I don't think, the same sort of stigma, notwithstanding the best efforts of some of the creative industries sector around piracy in Australia that there might be in other places, and that's a cultural question as well. Deputy Speaker, in supporting this legislation, I think it's really important that we and each of the speakers on this side of the House will be really clear about what is not affected by the passage of this legislation. This bill doesn't provide for an internet filter, in our view. It provides a judicial remedy on a case-by-case basis for conduct that flouts existing law. The requirements of the bill are strict, and we can expect federal court judges to exercise the site blocking power cautiously and with restraint. And Deputy Speaker, as someone who has herself practiced in the federal court and who is familiar with applications for injunction brought in the federal court, though not under copyright legislation, I will admit, I will say that one of the great strengths of the Australian judicial system is the great degree of expertise and responsibility exercised by the many learned judges that we are so fortunate to have in the Federal Court of Australia. And so, Deputy Speaker, in my view, it is appropriate that we look at striking the balance between the interests of producers and consumers, and it is wrong to cast that into some sort of dichotomy. It's not necessarily oppositional interests, because there's obviously a great deal of connection between the interests of a producer and the interests of a consumer. As I said at the very outset, as a consumer of digital content, I've got an interest in having producers in Australia who actually are able to have a viable business model for creating that content. Though I think the Federal Court of Australia is very well placed to strike that balance and to take a measured and appropriate approach when it comes to applications for injunctions in respect of websites that are aimed at whose primary purpose is to flout copyright laws. And so, Deputy Speaker, with great respect to the learned judges of the Federal Court, of course our Parliament can be very confident that they will exercise their power with appropriate degrees of restraint and in a manner that is cautious and appropriately strikes the balance between the sometimes competing and sometimes aligned interests of the different parties. Deputy Speaker, we are conscious that there has been some concerns raised about whether this legislation may block virtual private networks, VPNs, as they're referred to, to which people refer when they're raising concerns about this bill. We have worked very hard to seek to ensure that that isn't the case. And of course, Labor senators, as you know, Deputy Speaker on the Senate Legal and Constitutional Affairs Committee, investigated this specific issue about VPNs and whether this legislation would affect VPNs usage. Those Labor senators formed the view that the bill's terms would not extend to blocking VPN usage. To assist in ensuring that the legislation is construed that way, we've asked the government to amend the explanatory memorandum appropriately to clarify that that's not the intention of this legislation. We anticipate that the government will take that action and will appropriately amend the explanatory memorandum. Deputy Speaker, as I said at the outset, it is important though for government to think about what some of the drivers of anti-competitive behaviour, or perhaps just the absence of sufficient competition, might be in the market, and to find ways to ensure that consumers do benefit from the pricing benefits of having greater competition. It's a view that everyone in this, that I suspect that everyone in this House would very likely share. And Deputy Speaker, it's also important that the government pursue copyright reform more broadly. As you know, Labor commissioned an inquiry by the Australian Law Reform Commission into copyright law in the digital economy when we were in government. The ALRC provided the incoming Liberal government with its report in November 2013. But disappointingly, Deputy Speaker, 18 months later, the government has still not responded to that report or taken any steps to progress the full suite of reforms proposed by the ALRC. Perhaps the Attorney-General has been a little bit distracted with trying to repeal Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, but I would suggest that a better use of the Attorney-General's time would be to consider what actions might be taken to improve and reform copyright law. As you know, there are a lot of views in this country from producers and consumers and consumer advocacy groups alike that copyright law needs to be modernised, and that's quite a pressing and urgent need for modernisation in respect of copyright law. Deputy Speaker, this is an important bill. It's important, people might say, oh, well, who cares if people are downloading particular shows, or is this really the most important issue? But it is a very important issue, not just for the creative industries, not just for the many, many jobs in those industries, not just for the great economic benefits that our country derives from having creative industries here at home, but also because this is a broader question of access to art forms, to arts and culture in our society. And the fact is that it is so important that people from all social strata, whatever your background, you have access to the rich cultural life that our digital economy is now affording to people, and that digital content is now delivering into the homes. There is so much choice out there. There is so much access to high and low culture through these digital forms, and it's really important that that isn't just reserved for the people with the fastest broadband or the most money or the ability to the most technical proficiency. It is important that we deal with these issues of access to culture as a broad issue of concern to the entire Australian community. So, Deputy Speaker, I do look forward to continued and ongoing discussion about all of the many facets of dealing with this question of access to online content. I mentioned software, I mentioned movies, I mentioned music. It was remiss of me not to mention gaming. Gaming, of course, being a massive industry in itself. We do need to continue to engage with, and I know that change is fast, and I know that that all of these issues are evolving very quickly, and that government and of any persuasion can be a little slow to keep up with change. But the challenge for us, if we want to be a modern nation where people participate fully in the cultural life of the nation, then we have to find ways to improve the way that we grapple with copyright and all of the full suite of issues in respect of digital content. So, Deputy Speaker, as I say, we're supporting the bill. We believe it is modest and reasonable. We are fortified in our support by the fact that the Federal Court of Australia will be taking a responsible and cautious approach to administering to dealing with applications under the legislation. We continue to believe that pricing remains an issue, as does access to service. I know that the market is improving, but there is still more to be done here in Australia. Deputy Speaker, on that basis, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the bill, and we, as I say, will always take a critical and moderate approach to supporting any interventions in this area, because it is quite a nuanced and faceted question, but this, we believe, is a moderate and appropriate approach to this particular issue of combating online piracy. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.